everybody, and welcome to Old News, where the fossils are old, but discoveries are new. My name is Laura Beth. I will be your host today, so I will be keeping an eye on that chat and looking to see if you have questions or comments. We would love to hear from you, so just type into the chat if you have something to share. And I do want to remind you all that we have captions available for this live stream. We have automatic captions that you can see on the video by clicking that CC button. And we have transcriber generated captions that should be a little more accurate. And you can click that reader link that I shared in the chat to see those captions. So before I introduce our expert, I do want to give a quick shout out to some of our local schools here in North Carolina. So we've got Cross Creek Charter School in Lewisburg, North Carolina, and Lakeview Elementary School in Durham, North Carolina. We heard that y'all are excited about this month's topic, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we do. So without further ado, I will introduce Dr. Christian Kammerer, the museum's research curator of paleontology. Hey, Christian.
Hi, Laura Beth. Great to be here.
Yeah. So how you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm excited to talk about some very ancient and very strange creatures today for all our viewers.
Yeah, me too. And actually, I have bingo today to follow along. So I got to print a bingo sheet. And if y'all want to play bingo as well, I'll put a link in the chat. So those of you who didn't get to print it, you can play along and let us know if you win, right? And that'll help us learn about these weird wonders.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, they are fossils. So I'll give you the center square right off. Most of the things we talk about are indeed fossils. Maybe someday we'll talk about subfossils. Who knows? Yeah.
You're making it too easy, Christian.
But these ones, the ones we're going to be talking about today, are particularly ancient. Indeed, they are about as far back as animals go. And let me just bring up my screen here. And this is going all the way back to the beginning of what's called the Phanerozoic Eon, which is basically all of Earth's history where complex life has existed. So this is going back, as much as 540 million years ago to the beginning of the Cambrian period, the first part of the Paleozoic era. And so the Cambrian is an exciting part of Earth's history. It's a very important part of Earth's history. As an example, sort of why it's so important, like everything before the Cambrian is just called the Precambrian. Like that is, and the Precambrian is the majority of the history of life, Earth, and everything. Because like 540 million years is a long period of time, but life on Earth has been around for over 1 billion years. Earth itself is around 4.5 billion years. So billions and billions of years go by and we just call it Precambrian, like it's nothing, like it's just like not Cambrian, because what we're waiting for is just the excitement of the Cambrian. And this is because of the Cambrian explosion. So Cambrian explosion is a very well-known, although not necessarily well understood event in the history of life on Earth, where basically all of the major phyla, so those are basically the biggest groups of animals that you can imagine. So like all vertebrates, all arthropods, all mollusks, these really major animal groups, they all appear in the Cambrian. And we've talked about this a little bit on Old News before. We had a show about finding the first Cambrian bryozoans, which were one of the very few phyla that didn't have a Cambrian fossil record, and sort of showing that, yes, they were part of this Cambrian explosion, where we're going from seas that are full of bacteria and sort of like squishy kind of jellyfish-like creatures to this huge diversity of complex life of arthropods and worms and mollusks and even some of our ancestors. So Cambrian explosion, major event, historically best known from a site in the Canadian Rockies called the Burgess Shale, which is around 508 million years ago. And lately has been, we found other Lagerstätten. This is another thing we talk about a lot, these sites of exceptional preservation elsewhere on Earth, like in China and in Greenland, that has shown even more of the diversity of these Cambrian animals. They're just radiating wildly. And so the Cambrian explosion is something that was discussed a lot by the late evolutionary biologist and paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, particularly in his book Wonderful Life, which was one of my favorite books growing up, talking all about the Burgess Shale and sort of the Cambrian explosion. And Gould made a few sort of like core arguments about the Cambrian explosion. He discussed the creatures from the Burgess Shale as these, he called them weird wonders. And indeed they're very weird looking animals. You know, some of them have these grasping appendages on the front of the snout, on the front of the head. Things like Opabinia, the green one there, had 5 eyes and sort of this almost kind of like vacuum cleaner nozzle at the front of the head, which wasn't the mouth. The actual mouth is underneath the head. So this was almost more like an elephant's trunk sort of situation. And then all these lobopodian creatures with lots of little sort of fleshy legs and spines and things. Some of these animals had mouths that looked like pineapple slices. They're weird and wonderful creatures. But Gould's argument was that these are so fundamentally different from anything alive today that they must represent extinct phyla. So these are not any of the living phyla, they're totally different groups. And what's more, they are in a sense failed phyla because these creatures did not survive past the Cambrian explosion. You have this idea that these are, you know, as life is diversifying in the Cambrian, there's a huge amount of evolutionary experimentation, and it's sort of, you know, throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks. And some of these, you know, were successful and some of them just died out, maybe even too weird to survive for whatever reason. And he talked a lot about sort of the, you know, if you turned back the clock to the Cambrian, would you expect, you know, animal X or animal Y to be the success stories? So as an example of this, he talked about this animal Pikaia, which is just this tiny little swimming wormy thing. Not a very impressive looking creature, you know, not a big predator like Anomalocaris or, you know, heavily armored like some of these lobopods. You wouldn't expect that to be sort of the victor of, you know, the next 500 million years of life. But in fact, you know, this is the earliest known chordate. This is the phylum that vertebrates like ourselves, all bony animals belong to. And so Pikaia very similar to these animals called lancelets today, which are a type of chordate. So, you know, if we turned back the clock and Pikaia didn't survive, you know, none of us would be around. And if that was the case, you know, would one of these other groups have radiated? Would we have super intelligent Opabinias talking about how they were destined for greatness? And it's hard to say. So I mean, it's very heady stuff, as is typical of Gould's work. Really makes you think about all the contingencies that happen in deep time, how nothing is ever assured in paleontology. But with all that said, so when he was writing that book in the 1980s, the Burgess Shale had been known for around 100 years, but it was only recently sort of experiencing a renaissance in research on the fossils there. And like in the late 1970s, early 1980s, a lot of these animals like Opabinia and Anomalocaris were being sort of better understood and redescribed, but it was still, you know, relatively little information on Cambrian explosion faunas. And our knowledge of these groups has expanded exponentially since then, not only from whole new localities like those sites in China and Greenland that I mentioned, but also through like renewed fieldwork in the Burgess Shale and other parts of the Canadian Rockies, and also just new technology, like being able to look with fine microscopic detail and looking at CT scanning of some of these fossils, really understanding their anatomy much better than was possible at the time. And so this has actually forced us to reconsider, and in some cases, like pretty clearly refute some of Gould's ideas on these animals. So as an example of that, take one of the most iconic Burgess Shale creatures, Hallucigenia. Just its name sort of evokes its bizarre appearance, sort of like a hallucination. And as depicted at, back in the 1980s, it was a truly strange creature, like definitely unlike any living phylum. It was vaguely worm-like with this sort of bulb-like head. Instead of legs, it had sort of these broken toothpicks as struts or stilts that it was walking around on. Then sort of a nozzle for a tail, and then this series of tentacles down the back with little graspers that were thought maybe to be the mouth or the mouths of this thing. So, really difficult to interpret. But new specimens of Hallucigenia and sort of looking at them in more detail, we've figured out that actually it had been interpreted upside down. So what were thought to be those toothpick-like legs are actually spines on the back, and what were thought to be those tentacles are the legs with little claws, and what was thought to be the head was the tail, and the tail was the head. So it does, it's still a weird-looking creature. Like even the right side up Hallucigenia is a strange one, but it's not as uninterpretable. It's not something that we think represents a whole different phylum, because actually it looks very similar to when you look at it that way, to these other lobopods that are present in the Burgess Shale, these sort of fleshy-legged worm-like creatures that have a bunch of spines on them themselves. So first part of it is that not all the weird wonders were quite as weird as we originally thought. The other thing is really more fundamental. That's just like one misinterpreted fossil, and people misinterpret fossils all the time. Like Gould was not the one to misinterpret it. That he was just, going off of what was in the literature already about Hallucigenia. But this idea that, the weird wonders represent extinct phyla that were evolutionary dead ends, whereas, some of the lesser known creatures like Pikaia were the success stories. And this turns out to be resoundingly false, because the discovery of like both new transitional specimens and just like more knowledge of the anatomy has shown that most of the weirdest wonders, things like Anomalocaris and Opabinia, were not failures at all. Like they were indeed some of the ancestral groups, not necessarily direct ancestors, but sort of on that lineage leading to what is by far the most successful group of organisms of all time, which is the arthropods, which just in terms of animal biomass and number of species of seemingly any organism, they are the victors. Like when you're talking about, so insects, of course, arachnids, crustaceans, this is just a hugely successful group, much more so in many ways than vertebrates like ourselves. So rather than being these sort of like failed dead ends, things like the lobopods, including Hallucigenia, Opabinia, and then this group, the radiodonts, which includes Anomalocaris, that big sort of grasping mustache guy. These are part of the evolutionary history of this, arthropod radiation going back into the Cambrian. So if you went and turned back the clock and Anomalocaris succeeded, things would probably be pretty same to the modern day, because the radiodonts, they did, had a very long run of it and still have ancestors living now. Then the other thing, and it's not just arthropods either, a lot of the weird wonders in the Cambrian that were thought to be distinct phyla, they're sort of finding their place among the known phyla. There are still sort of a few holdouts that may be like truly extinct dead end lineages, but for the most part, like all the classic weird wonders are members of modern groups, or at least sort of on the stem, sort of in the ancestry of those groups. I guess one other example here. So let me put up, this is got a little, you can show you the size of it. This is an animal called Wawaxia, which is sort of this, it's covered in all these little scales and has these paired spines down the back. This is another one that was considered one of sort of the weird wonders by Gould, because it doesn't really look exactly like anything today. Maybe a little bit like certain marine worms. But there's been a lot of work recently looking at the internal anatomy of Wowachia, and like even things like we know how the mouth and the guts looked. And there's increasing evidence that Wowachia is actually one of the early members of this group that includes the mollusks, which is also, one of the most abundant and, diverse groups of animals today. So everything, squid, octopus, snails, clams, scallops, that whole group are mollusks. So things like Wowachia, actually were success stories in their own right as well.
And Christian, I have a quick question before you return to your slides.
Yeah.
Is your model, your toy model of Wowachia, is that life size?
This one I think is slightly larger than life, but it's around that. So for the most part, these Cambrian creatures were quite small. Anomalocaris is actually the biggest one, which could get maybe a foot long. There were a few that could get, a few feet long, some of these bigger radiodonts. Things like Picaya are tiny, and Obabinia, hallucigenia, these are like little, like fit on your finger type things.
Oh.
Yeah.
We've got some folks in the chat who are saying that the creatures are terrifying. And let's see, Dylan said that hallucigenia is a mix of H.R. Geiger and Dolly.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Definitely has some of that sort of
form.
That alien appearance to it.
Yeah.
And yeah, a lot of these things they are, to modernize, very strange, which is why it took so long and like really needed detailed anatomical work to sort of get past just like, oh, nothing looks like this, to, well, actually, if you take, look at the structure of the eyeball, the structure of this mouth part, the structure of this leg, you can see those little connections between better known things. Like this kind of looks like part of a crustacean, this kind of looks part of a horseshoe crab sort of thing, finding that homology, which is what we call it, just, finding what is same between organisms, just one of the bedrocks of our science.
Very cool. All right, you can continue.
Yeah. So that's getting back to sort of the success story in many ways of the Weird Wonders. It's not just that they're on the line to these better known groups, but we now know that they survived past the Cambrian. So, a lot of Gould's argument was predicated on the idea that these animals have only been found in the Burgess Shale. So thus they would have gone extinct afterwards. And as we're finding more and more of these Lagerstätten later in the Paleozoic, it's become very clear that that's not the case. So it's an artifact of preservation. We found the Weird Wonders in the Burgess Shale because it was the only place that preserved soft-bodied organisms. So as we're looking in new sites, like in Morocco, there's part of the rock record there called the Feijoada Formation in the next period after the Cambrian, the Ordovician. And what do we find there? Lots and lots of these Weird Wonders. So this is an animal called Agarocassis, which is another radiodont, like Anomalocaris. And if anything, as they went on, they were getting even weirder, if you ask me. So Agarocassis is a much bigger animal, may have been as much as like 2 meters, 6 feet or so long, was kind of this giant, almost like the hood of a car or the nose cone of an airplane off of the top. And then those grasping appendages that Anomalocaris would have used to grab its prey have been transformed into these filter feeding structures, almost like the baleen of a whale. So it's become sort of a more whale-like radiodont than Anomalocaris. So just very strange animals, but still clearly doing well in the Ordovician. And then this group survives all the way into the Devonian. So there are things like Schinderhannes here from the Hunsrück slate in Germany that look, clearly radiodonts. They have the grasping appendages, they have the pineapple slice mouth, all these classic radiodont features. So rather than being sort of a dead end in the Cambrian, we have these groups throughout the early Paleozoic. So, maybe as much as 200 million years of Earth's history with these radiodonts and other weird wonders sort of swimming through the ocean. So, I mean, if you ask me, that's a pretty successful history, considering that, even when we talk about stuff like dinosaurs being success stories, they weren't around for 200 million years straight. Pretty close, but like radiodonts really were doing well. And so let's sort of shift gears from that background to talking about what the actual new discovery is. And this is one of the lesser known weird wonders, and maybe not as weird because this is one that's been known to be an arthropod for a long time. Like this clearly has the jointed limbs of an early arthropod, but one that they could never place. So this was also thought to be just kind of this dead end line. It's not an ancestor of crustaceans or of spiders or of insects or anything like that. So these are the marellomorphs. So marellomorphs, these are tiny little creatures. These are only, at most a few centimeters long. And it's named after this one species, Marella splendens, from the Burgess Shale, which you can see a fossil on the right, and sort of a life reconstruction from Gould's book on the left. So Marella is probably the most abundant fossil found in the Burgess Shale. There are thousands of specimens known. There may even be millions there. They haven't counted or collected all the fossils of Marella. So compared to things like Hallucigenia that are only known from a few specimens, Anomalocaris and Opabinia, these are, I can probably count on one hand the number of specimens of some of these taxa. Marella is super common and clearly was, very successful in the Cambrian. But it's also, one of those groups that you sort of stop hearing about outside of the context of the Burgess Shale marellomorphs. They look similar to trilobites. So, trilobites, these are this group that are like the iconic success stories of Paleozoic arthropods. Like trilobites are through every ocean on our Earth, thousands of species, millions of specimens known. So like trilobites, they're doing great until they eventually die out at the end Permian mass extinction. But some of these other, weird arthropods from the Burgess Shale, like Sancticaris and Marella, and this whole group called bivalved arthropods or great appendage arthropods. Those were sort of like the losers of the group, and they didn't really like play a major role in ecosystems after the Burgess Shale and sort of the Cambrian explosion. Or at least this was the traditional wisdom circa, early 1980s. And this is also one that, now is very much being overturned, and new evidence like for a few years now has started to overturn this, but, really finding beautifully preserved specimens showing that marellomorphs too were quite a success even beyond the Cambrian. So the new species we're going to be talking about today, this new marellomorph, is also from the Ordovician, like that big filter feeding radiodont. So this is after the Cambrian, the next period. And this one was found actually just north of Toronto in southern Ontario in Canada. So not a site that is, thought of as sort of a major fossil hunting region, up in the Canadian Rockies where the Burgess Shale is, and then in Western Canada that has all these incredible dinosaur bearing deposits, really well known for fossils. And a few spots out east, like there's a Dimetrodon fossil that was found in Prince Edward Island. There's some Devonian fish that are very well known from Quebec. But this is from a historically pretty fossil poor part of Canada. So it's sort of a shock that they found such a really incredibly well-preserved fossil there. So before I show you the fossil, this is the life restoration of the animal. And like Agaricassus, marellomorphs, I would argue, they didn't stop being weird. In fact, they only got weirder as time went on. So you've gone from the weird wonders in the Cambrian to even weirder wonders from the Ordovician onwards. So it has the same sort of basic body structure as Marella, this animal which is called Tomlinsonus, new genus of marellomorph, where it has sort of that, vaguely sort of crab or shrimp-like body with a bunch of little legs in the back and gills associated with it. But then this big head shield that is broken off into different spines that are covered with all of these little, don't even know what we would call them, sort of protrusions, ramifications, things where the spine is splitting up into a lot of basically little spines, almost look kind of feathery, although they would have been in life, have chitinous covering there. But this is, really incredibly well preserved for the age. Like for the most part, like the Ordovician fossils, we're getting just hard shelly things. So trilobites, like brachiopods, these shelled creatures that look kind of like clams. A lot of the echinoderms that have calcite skeletons you get of this age, but you don't get these sort of like really squishy, tiny things much. So really important to look carefully, and also this was based in part on new imaging technology of being able to put different types of light, like UV light, on specimens that we've talked about a little bit before with like some of the Chinese dinosaur feathers, and like looking at fish soft body scales, where we can even tell the colors of some of these things with like fluorescing the specimens. But yeah, this is also a tiny specimen. So you can see if you look at the scale bar here, this is 5 millimeters. So this is like almost, not quite microscopic, but this is a very little creature. So very hard to see in the field. This is one of those things where you're sort of collecting rock and then you're probably not recognizing some of these things, at least all the anatomy of these things, until you're back in the laboratory and have better equipment with it. But Tomlinsonus, it is part of what turns out to be a increasing amount of marellomorphs from all over the world found in the Ordovician. So it's sort of the latest find, but just in the past couple of years, there have been a bunch of these. And it really is indicative that these were still like, major components of marine ecosystems all over. It's not that, Tomlinsonus is sort of a relic, a holdout of former Cambrian successes. It really just is we didn't have the right types of rock to preserve these. So wherever we find soft-bodied fossils, marellomorphs seem to be there in the Ordovician. And there is reason to suspect they may have, survived quite a bit longer than that. So this is just a family tree of marellomorphs and other related arthropods. So the marellomorphs are up on top, and you can see Tomlinsonus is the new one here, reconstructed with all of these, the little ramifications or sort of feathery bits on the head shield. And you see that there's one branch of the tree that goes even further into, more recent strata into the Devonian. And so this is an animal that actually is also from the Hunsrück slate in Germany. This is the same sites that yield that late living radiodont Schinderhannes. And this last one may actually, for my money, be the strangest marellomorph of all. This animal, Mimetaster hexagonalis. So here's a life reconstruction here of this creature. And so the head shield has become sort of this starburst hexagon thing. So 6 protrusions, each of which has their own spines sticking off of it. And then the forelimbs have become massively enlarged, almost kind of looks like a spider crab, but then retaining this very tiny sort of, tail with these big feathery gills coming off of it. So don't know what this animal was doing. The marellomorphs in general have been argued to be detritivores, so just like sifting the sediment and sort of the muck and eating decayed material and sort of organic material inside the mud or the sand. And that may well be the case. I mean, there are a lot of crustaceans today that do that. They're part of nature's cleanup crew. They're very important parts of ecosystems. But I feel also like, just like paleontologists often call things detritivores when they don't know, when it's not really obvious what they're doing otherwise. Like if they don't have big crushing teeth or mouth parts that clearly were adapted to, a very obvious purpose. It's just like, well, maybe they were eating detritus. We can't really be sure. So I think there's still a lot left to learn about marellomorphs. It's one of those things where, only in the past few years really is their true diversity becoming clear, and, more and more and increasingly strange ones keep being found. So, as we, learn more, just have more specimens, I think there's a lot more we can learn about the biology of these things. Marella itself, so there's no shortage of fossils there. So there's certainly a lot of work to be done just within the Marella population. But then with all these other later marellomorphs throughout the Paleozoic, I think there's going to be a lot more of these found in the coming years.
Yeah. So We have so many good questions in the chat,
All right,
Christian.
I'm
I think
ready.
everyone is super excited, including me. So this is a group that I don't know a lot about, and I
Mhm.
always love when we do that kind of topic on old news because I have so many questions. But we'll start first with a question asked by Jade about those feathery projections off of the head shield that
Yeah.
you talked about. Yeah. So would you say that those feathery projections could be called cilia-like?
They do look a lot like cilia. I would say probably not though, because they seem to be rigid. So one of the things about cilia is that they're motile. So they move around, they wiggle, and that either helps, move water over an organism or a cell, or, if they're big enough, you kind of call them flagella to help move like a bacterium around. Whereas it seems like these structures in the marellomorphs were stable, they were solid. So, but they're soft-ish. Like they're not, they're not calcified, so they don't have the mineral calcium reinforcing them like a lot of better preserved crustaceans, for instance. But they would have had sort of the same thing that all arthropods have, chitin, keeping it pretty solid. I think probably it's most like, and I don't know the function of them. Like if anyone's asking what is the function of those things, I have no idea. But it's possible that it was something, if you look at some certain insects today, like tree hoppers, where they have these incredibly elaborate, sort of spines sticking out of the head, some of which are used for display, some of which are used for camouflage. Maybe these things were trying to look like some of the many star-shaped animals that were living on the seabed at that time, be they sea anemones or basket stars or any of these starfish type things. I really don't know.
And so Jade also was wondering, these spines, do you think they could have been defensive?
Yeah,
like if they weren't super soft? Yeah, go
that's
ahead.
definitely a possibility. So especially like when they become, pretty elaborate in the later ones and fairly delicate in something like Mimetaster. And another one that we didn't talk about, but another Ordovician one called Furca. So I would have trouble seeing that as being like too good at protecting the animal. But like in Marella itself, they're very solid, and it's almost kind of like a bull's horns with serrated edges. So for Marella, I can definitely see that being for protective purposes. And then maybe it was one of those things that was just kind of like elaborated on as this group of animals, evolved through the years.
I see. And so Jade also was wondering, what was the Cambrian period like? Like, what was Earth like during this period?
So Earth was very different. And I have it for the Ordovician, but let me bring this slide up again, because I think it's worth talking about. So the continents were not like we know them today. So keep in mind, remember that Tomlinsonus, the new marellomorph, was found in Canada, which today is one of the most northern countries on Earth and gets up to the Arctic Circle. And in the Cambrian and the Ordovician, it was actually in the southern hemisphere. So you see, these are like what the continents looked like then, very different than they are now. So a lot of the northern hemisphere just covered in ocean. There were, with having all the continents in the southern hemisphere, there were big glaciers were able to cover a lot of the Earth's surface. So this is so long ago that Pangaea, which you probably know as the one supercontinent, where all the continents were one, that was not the oldest continent on Earth. So Pangaea actually formed in the Permian. And before that, there were all these proto-continents just kind of like scattered through the southern hemisphere. So yeah, and in the Cambrian, there would not have been any life on land, except maybe a few bacteria. So we don't get the first evidence of complex life, so plants and animals moving onto land. Really good evidence for it until the Silurian. There was probably some early adopters, as it were, in the late Ordovician. And then things like bugs and vertebrates, vertebrates come on land into the Devonian, bugs in the Silurian. So a lot of the Earth's surface on land just would have been bare rock. without any life on it. So really, really weird, totally alien to our view today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got that bingo item pretty quickly. Something alien-like. That was an easy one. Yeah, so also Jade has a new idea that maybe the spines were for display for mating purposes, or maybe that they evolved into display for mating purposes. Yeah, do we have any idea what these animals were really doing? I mean,
no,
sounds like we don't.
But I mean, that sort of like selection for display is something that we see in a lot of different groups today. So it's, yeah, certainly possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was wondering about the color. So the picture of Tomlinsonus,
yeah.
Tomlinsonus. It's so mesmerizing with how colorful it is. Do we have any indication of the color? Is that a guess because anything's possible?
Yeah, I think it's an educated guess. We don't have color preservation in this particular fossil. We do in some Paleozoic animals. I think that color palette in particular was chosen because it is, I mean, there are arthropods today that look like that. Mantis shrimp in particular have that kind of green rainbow coloration to them. So it's definitely something that we know arthropods can do. But yeah, we don't know that Tomlinsonus particularly was that color.
Yeah, and a lot of arthropods today also have fluorescent pigments or compounds in their exoskeleton. So do you think that could have been in these creatures as well, or do we know that they evolved later? What do you think?
Oh, no, absolutely. They could have been in these animals. So things that are fluorescent, things that can only be seen with UV, things that can only be seen infrared. More and more researchers are basically like shining weird lights on animals and seeing what glows. It's a great, field of research. It's very, lots of new work being done on the shine lights on animals field.
Like live animals or fossilized?
Both.
Animals. Both. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of so many cool discoveries, like the fact that chameleon skeletons are fluorescent.
They are.
Yeah, and that actually chameleons have like tips of their bones that almost come out of the skin and glow under fluorescent light. All sorts of weird stuff like that. And that's because we, for a long time, like we only looked at the natural world the way our eyes see it. That was the only way we could look at the natural world. But human eyes and mammal eyes in general only see part of the spectrum of light. So basically the named colors are the ones we can see. So infrared means like less than red. So those are the ones that are lower outside of the spectrum than red. And then ultraviolet, which is the opposite side of the rainbow, are things that are beyond violet. So, they're colors that exist, but we can't see them. Our eyes just are not evolved to see those colors. But lots of animals can see those colors. And so like insects, birds, various other groups that have eyes, like squids and octopuses, some of them can see fluorescence, they can see ultraviolet. And so there are colorations on various organisms. Like there's a lot of flowers that have fluorescent or sort of ultraviolet color there that bees can see, but we can't. So who knows what some of these Paleozoic things may have had, both in terms of what we would be able to see of them and then what they could see of themselves. We'll never know some of it.
Yeah. I in general don't really believe that we should be like tinkering with DNA of people, but I have to say that if we discovered a way to allow humans to see more colors, by taking DNA code from other types of species, I don't know, I think I'd be down for that. I would want to see all the colors that it's possible to see. Maybe one day. But so, okay, going back to the actual fossils that were in this discovery, you showed us pictures of them, and to me, they look like they're imprint fossils, like kind of like if we were to go outside when it snows and make a snow angel, we're leaving an imprint of our bodies. So is that what kind of fossils these are, or are they actual fossilized body parts?
They are actual body parts, but they're compression fossils. So that means that it was a squishy organism that was deposited in the sediment, in the mud, and then it was crushed flat during the fossilization process. So when more and more sediment piles on top, the weight just crushes the animal. And this is another reason why the Weird Wonders, it was so difficult to interpret them for so long, because we don't have perfect three-dimensional versions of them. And back in the 70s, they even if for some of the specimens, they tried to do micro dissection of their prep off microscopic layers to look at the guts. And now we can use CT scans to do that. So even though it's still not ideal, because these things are usually only a few millimeters thick because they have been compressed, but you can at least see some variation in the internal organs. And so we're learning more about that. And there are some sites that do get proper three-dimensional preservation. So pretty rare, but where a lot of silica was in the water, where they used to find them and they'd section them. So what they'd do is they'd have a rock that has a fossil in it, and they'd grind it down millimeter by millimeter, and then either with wax make an outline of it or draw it, and then they'd rebuild the model after the fossil was totally destroyed to see what it looked like in 3 dimensions. And so that's what they had to do back in the 20th century. Now here in the 21st century, we can use computed tomography to see the inside of it, almost as if by magic. But yeah, but most of these, they're compression fossils.
Okay. Yeah, I was not aware of compression fossils. I think maybe it's not my first time seeing them, but it's my first time hearing that term. So are they usually already dead when they're being squished? Or
they were not.
They die? Okay.
They were not being killed by the compression, thankfully.
Okay. Had me feeling bad for some extinct creatures.
Yeah, don't worry about
it. Okay, so we have just a couple minutes, so I'll do 2 more questions from our chat here.
Okay.
So Anne wanted to know, during this time period, was there lichen around on Earth?
So fungus, yes, and algae, yes. We don't. So the origins of the symbiosis between fungus and algae that creates lichens, it's clearly fairly ancient, but it's one of those things where we don't have a great fossil record of it. So it's possible it may have existed in the Permian, not in the Permian, it definitely existed in the Permian, in the Cambrian, but to my knowledge, there's no fossil record of it. And it seems there aren't many even fungus on land at that time. It really does seem like a barren landscape. So lichens are mostly they're a land-based group of organisms. So not as much in the marine realm. So I'd be surprised if there were too many. Right.
Yeah. And then Jade wanted to know, why does silica help with fossil preservation?
So it is, it's the difference between what we call preservational regimes. That's all that means is the type of rock that it was preserved in, and sort of how that rock turned from sediment into rock. So in the case of silica, silica, is what makes up sand, what makes up quartz. It's a very, it's silicon rich minerals. And so what happens with those is the silicified fossils, which are organisms that have been turned to silica, basically. What happens is, rather than being squished by mud and then preserved as these compressions inside mud, as they're being fossilized, their skeleton, all the little pores in it, are being filled with sort of this liquid silica material, similar to actually how opals form. And when that lithifies, when it turns into rock, it basically creates it hardens the specimen. Silica is incredibly difficult fossils to work with because it's just solid rock. But what that does is it protects the specimen and sort of keeps it in its original shape. So it isn't, even if there is compression from above just by the weight of all the sediment, the silica usually stays pretty stable. So you're able to get really high quality restorations of what the animal would have looked like.
Are they ever like beautiful fossils in that case when that happens?
For the Cambrian stuff, not really. They're mostly like microscopic.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
they're certainly beautiful to a scientist, but they're
Yeah.
not. For the most part, like even when you look at them, they're just kind of yellowish, brownish type things. It's not like the opalized fossils that you get like in the Cretaceous of Australia, or the ammonite. So ammonite is like when ammonites, these squid-like shelled creatures from the Mesozoic. Um, in some cases they have become sort of the shell has become this rainbow precious stone really that's mined as jewelry, which is called ammonite. So you can get
Wow.
fossils with, really incredible sort of general aesthetic properties, let's say that, beyond just interest to scientists, but not the Cambrian ones.
Gotcha. All right, folks. Well, that is all the time we have today for old news, but I would like to thank Christian for sharing his expertise and giving us the context of this research and telling us why it's important. Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, pleasure as always.
I want to thank, and Jade got bingo, and Taylor. Congratulations,
Oh,
Jade and Taylor. Great
congrats,
job.
folks.
Right at the end there, you got bingo. Perfect timing. And I would also like to thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to the Royal Ontario Museum for helping us share this research. And join us May 10th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be our next episode of Old News. That will be our final episode before the summer break starts for us. So we hope you can join us then. And thank you again. Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe out there.